You thought the mirror universe was just a dark reflection of the heroes we love to watch. A timeline gone wrong. A cautionary tale. But what if it wasn't the copy? What if the prime timeline was? There's a theory. One Q would never confirm, because he doesn't have to. It's the theory that the mirror universe was the first iteration of humanity. Brutal, efficient, cold. A species that conquered before it could connect. That burned worlds long before it explored them. In Q, he watched, observed, and in the end, decided to start again. Our timeline, the prime timeline, might be a second draft. A final chance to prove humanity could be something better. More evolved, more idealistic, worth saving. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe Q seeded both, not to guide us, but to gather evidence. 2 experiments, 2 results, and 1 inevitable judgment. The mirror universe wasn't an accident. It was the beginning or the proof. And either way, our heroes were never meant to survive. Q didn't just annoy humanity, he judged it. From the very beginning, in Encounter at Farpoint, Q places himself in the role of accuser. A godlike being dragging humanity into a courtroom to answer for centuries of violence, war, and brutality. He called them dangerous, savage, childlike, and he didn't say it lightly. Q isn't impressed by their technology nor their diplomacy. He's not fascinated by the ships or the science. He's watching who they are, what they do when nobody is watching. The first encounter wasn't about the Enterprise. It wasn't about Picard. It was about humanity. But here's the detail that's often overlooked. Q never stopped the trial. In All Good Things, years later, he reveals the truth. The trial never ended. Everything they've done since Farpoint has been under constant observation. And more importantly, it's not just a test of capability, it's a test of character. That becomes clear in Q Who. Q snaps the crew into Borg space, not because he's cruel, but because he's right. He forces Picard to see the truth. Humanity isn't ready. It's arrogant, complacent, too confident in its own righteousness. When Picard pleads for help, Q doesn't mock him. He gives it. And then he gives a warning. If you can't take a bloody nose, maybe you ought to go back home and crawl under your bed. It's not safe out here. That's not a prank. It's a warning shot. Q sees the Federation's idealism, but he also sees its fragility. And his role, whether we like it or not, is to press against it, to expose the cracks before the universe does. He doesn't cause humanity's failures. He forces our heroes to face them. But that brings up a deeper question, because for all of Q's meddling, he never once interferes with the mirror universe. Not once does he intervene. Not once does he test their morals, challenge their thinking, or drag them into judgment. He lets it burn. From the original series, to Deep Space Nine, to Discovery, the mirror timeline spirals deeper into bloodshed, and Q does nothing. Why? If his purpose is to evaluate humanity, wouldn't the mirror universe be the clearest example of their potential for savagery? Unless Q already knows what happens when humanity grows without restraint. Unless the mirror universe was the first trial, a control group. What happens when humans are given power without principle? What does civilization become without Picard, without Starfleet ethics, without restraint? And maybe Q saw that. Maybe he let it happen. Maybe he watched as the Terran Empire expanded, enslaved, and exterminated until he had his answer. And then he started over. Our hero's timeline, the Prime timeline, the second draft. He interferes not because he's interested, but because this version is still being written. The Mirror Universe doesn't get Q's attention because its story already ended, and humanity is still on trial. We know it as the Mirror Universe, a funhouse distortion, a twisted version of the Prime timeline. But what if it's been misunderstood completely? What if the Mirror Universe isn't the reflection, it's the original? In Mirror Mirror, we're introduced to a savage humanity, a Terran empire built on fear, conquest, and absolute control, where assassination is policy and compassion is weakness. This wasn't a world that diverged slightly. It's one that evolved entirely differently. The timeline feels older, sharper, less idealistic, as if no moral guardrails were ever installed. There's no Federation, no Prime Directive, no Starfleet of explorers, only a violent machine designed to dominate. Now step back and ask yourself this. If Q was watching that universe, what would he have seen? The worst instincts of humanity, unrestrained, power without principle, progress without compassion. In other words, a failed species. And if that was his first glimpse of humanity, maybe that's why he gave them a second chance. Not because they earned it, but because he wasn't done testing. The Prime timeline, in this context, becomes something else entirely. A sandbox, a second draft, a hypothetical scenario. What if humanity had restraint? What if it built alliances instead of empires? What if it reached for justice, not just survival? From this angle, the Mirror Universe isn't a parallel timeline. It's just the first creation in a larger experiment. Q didn't interfere in that world because its trajectory was already complete. He didn't test it because it already failed. But with humanity, he interferes constantly. He pokes, prods, judges, and challenges. Because humanity's outcomes haven't been decided yet. And if you look closely, Starfleet's leaders, from Kirk to Picard to Janeway, are all, in their own way, versions of the test subject. Kirk's idealism, Picard's logic, Janeway's moral compromise. Q isn't targeting them randomly. He's studying responses, seeing whether this humanity is better. But maybe here's the truth Q already knows. Something we're all afraid to admit. The people in the Mirror Universe aren't different. They're the same people, same minds, same emotions, just shaped by a harsher world. Look at Mirror T'Pol. Calm, rational, controlled, not cruel, just constrained. Look at Mirror Cisco. Smuggler, pirate, opportunist, but still in love, still human, still capable of attachment. Even Mirror Spock, the most logical man in both universes, eventually tries to reform the Terran Empire. These aren't twisted copies. These are the same souls, just raised in different cages. So what if Q's experiment isn't to see whether humanity can be good, but whether goodness can survive? Strip away Utopia, remove Starfleet, take away the Federation's safety net, and what's left? People who look like our heroes, sound like them, feel like them, but given just a little less hope, they become monsters. And if that's all it takes to break them, then maybe Q already has his answer. Or maybe that's why he's still watching. Because this time, humanity still has a chance. Let's flip the script. So far we've asked, what if Q saw the mirror universe fail and gave humanity a second chance? But what if it's the opposite? What if Q seeded both universes, not out of curiosity, but out of certainty? What if our heroes were never the chosen ones, just the final experiment? In every timeline we've seen, humans eventually become dangerous. In the mirror universe, they conquer. In the prime timeline, they assimilate. Not with force, but with ideology. The Federation doesn't burn planets. It makes them want to join. Soft power, cultural absorption, diplomacy with a smile. And Q sees that. He sees the subtle coercion, the quiet colonization. He watches them offer utopia in exchange for conformity, and calls it peace. Remember what Michael Eddington said in Deep Space Nine. You're worse than the Borg. At least they tell you about their plans for assimilation. To Q, it's not how many ships they build. It's about what kind of future they impose. So maybe Q created two timelines, not to find the best one, but to prove they're both the same. One collapses into violence, the other wraps violence in protocol. And the scariest part is, they don't even notice. They celebrate their restraint while building warships. They call it peacekeeping while surrounding worlds with fleets. We praise Starfleet captains for their ethics. Right after they lie, cheat, or break the Prime Directive to get the job done. This isn't just failure, it's delusion. And Q? He's not impressed. Because Q doesn't just test individuals, he tests civilizations. He watched Picard to see if one man's morality could steer a species. He introduced the Borg to see what they'd become when threatened. He gave them himself, a trickster, a mirror, a voice that never stops asking, "What are you really?" Now imagine that every time they pat themselves on the back, Q adds a page to the file. Every time they compromise their values in the name of security, every time they sacrifice the few to protect the many, every time they justify a small lie to protect the big truth. It goes in the evidence folder. He doesn't need to destroy them. He just needs to prove that they'd do it themselves. And if that's true, then the Prime Timeline isn't a second chance. It's the closing argument. One version of humanity burned the galaxy with ambition. The other may do it with good intentions. And Q, he doesn't care about their intentions, only their outcomes. At some point, Q went silent. After years of judging, challenging, and interfering, he vanished. We don't see him in the Dominion War. He ignores the bloodshed of the Cardassian occupation. He stays silent during the fall of Romulus. And during the burn, he never shows up. But why? If Q's purpose was to test us, why disappear when the tests got hardest? The simple answer is this. Maybe the trial is over. Maybe he's seen enough. What we did in the mirror universe told him what our heroes are when they have no constraints. And what they've done in the prime timeline tells him what they become when they do. They build, they aspire, they talk about peace. And still, they lie, they fight, they destroy. Q didn't need to end them. He just needed to stop speaking. And that's worse, because it means the outcome may already be decided. Think about it. In all good things, Q gives Picard one last chance to save humanity. Not by stopping a war, but by thinking differently. He rewards introspection, moral growth, abstract reasoning. But since then, the decisions of humanity have become more reactionary, more tactical, less idealist. The Federation fights more wars, makes more compromises, and becomes harder and colder with each generation. What if Q stepped back not because they passed, but because they failed? What if the verdict has already been written, and Q's just letting the sentence carry itself out? Because that's the real power of Q. He doesn't cause their downfall. He just shows them the mirror. He lets them prove who they really are, without saying another word. So if Q never speaks again, maybe that's not mercy. Maybe it's the moment the judge leaves the courtroom. We talk about the mirror universe as if it's full of monsters, but the truth is more complicated. Because if you strip away the uniforms, the rank, the brutality, what you're left with isn't evil. It's people. People shaped by different systems, different histories, different consequences. And the more you look, the more you realize they're not all that different. I brought him up before, but Mirror Cisco was a smuggler, a thief, maybe even a killer. But he loved Jennifer. That love was real. It wasn't conditioned. It wasn't transactional. And when she died, a piece of him went with her. Mirror Jennifer, when confronted by the Prime Cisco, didn't act like a stranger. She saw the man she had lost. And for a moment, the timeline didn't matter. The love still existed, even if the world had erased it. Mirror Spock tried to reform the Empire. He didn't have to. He had power, influence, command. But logic told him the system was unsustainable, that morality had utility, that survival required compassion. Mirror Tuvok, one of the few Vulcans to maintain discipline under Terran rule, joins the rebellion, not out of ambition, but principle. And Mirror Kira? Well, she's complicated. A predator in power, yes, but still driven by belief, passion, purpose. She didn't become evil. She became what the world required her to be. What all of this points to is something terrifying, because it means that humanity's nature might be stable across universes. That the people don't change. Only the environment does. And that's what Q may be watching. He doesn't need to see what happens when you create better humans. He needs to see what happens when you put those same humans under different pressures. The mirror universe isn't just chaos. It's a stress test, a war simulation, a trial by fire. And prime humanity? We like to think they're more noble, that their better angels won. But Q might not be so sure, because what he's seen, and what we've seen, is that the same capacity for love, growth, and reform exists in the darkest corners of the multiverse. But so does the capacity for betrayal, violence, and domination. Even in the Enlightened Federation. We see it in Section 31, in the Maquis, in Starfleet's compromise during the Dominion War, in Picard's betrayal of the Romulans. Sometimes, all it takes is one shift, one death, one order, one mission gone wrong. All of this for someone to become the version they never thought they'd be. So maybe Q isn't testing whether they're better. Maybe he's testing whether they're resistant. Can human decency survive under pressure? Can compassion endure in a world that punishes it? Can truth survive propaganda? Can trust survive betrayal? These are the questions Mirror Spock, Mirror Jennifer, and even Mirror Cisco started to answer. Not with philosophy, but with action. So what is the human constant? It's not good or evil. It's not progress or power. It's potential. Q sees it, and he's watching for the moment when that potential either ignites or collapses. Because if we are the same people in every universe, then the only real difference between salvation and damnation is the story we choose to live in. What if the mirror universe wasn't the only test? What if Q wasn't just watching humanity, but all of it? Every timeline, every captain, every war. Not as isolated events, but as exhibits in one ongoing trial. We know Q likes to focus on individuals. Picard, Janeway, even Riker. But what if that's just the surface layer? What if every crisis, every anomaly, every challenge sent by Q was part of something much bigger? A stress test for reality itself. Think about it. In All Good Things, Q tells Picard the trial never ended. Not his trial, humanity's. But humanity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation to others. The Klingons, the Romulans, the Borg, the Prophets, the Dominion. And Q, he's been watching all of them too. Maybe not directly, but always circling, always nudging, always interfering, just enough. What if the true purpose of Q's games wasn't to see what they would do when pushed, but to see what the galaxy becomes when humanity leads it? The Federation offers peace, but peace on its terms. It creates unity, but unity through assimilation. It teaches values, but punishes dissent. And every time the Federation's reach expands, Q is there. Not to stop it, but to watch it happen. In Voyager, Q tempts Janeway with power, reproduction, even omnipotence. But what he's really doing is asking, what happens when your morality is no longer tested by limits? She refuses, she remains human, and he seems amused. We also see this happen with Riker. With both of them, he's not impressed, not disappointed, just curious. Because the trial isn't about passing or failing, it's about revealing. So maybe it's not just the mirror universe on trial. It's not even just humanity. Maybe it's the Federation itself, its ideology, its contradictions, its trajectory. The more it grows, the more Q watches. Not to stop the future, but to document how it arrives. And in that light, every war is data. Every moral compromise is a variable. Every captain's decision is another data point in a cosmic argument. Not about whether the prime timeline survives, but whether it should. We've been waiting for a verdict. Ever since Encounter at Farpoint, we've assumed that Q's trial of humanity would end with a decision. Guilty or not guilty. Worthy or not. But what if the verdict already happened, and we just didn't notice? Think about how Q behaves in his final appearances. He stops taunting. He stops teaching. He becomes quieter. Less like a judge, more like someone in watching a conclusion unfold. In all good things, he congratulates Picard for expanding his mind, but he never says humanity passed. He only says, "See you out there." That's not reassurance. That's a warning. By the time we see Q again, in Star Trek Picard, he's dying. He says goodbye to Picard, gives him closure, but doesn't give humanity absolution. He calls it his final lesson. But what if it's actually the closing argument? Because maybe Q already saw what he needed to see long ago. The Mirror Universe gave him the first draft. The Prime Timeline became the second. Both were flawed. One consumed by violence, the other defined by contradictions. And maybe that was the point. Q wasn't looking for heroes. He was documenting their story. And when it became clear that they would write it themselves, that they would repeat the same mistakes, even while reaching for something better, Q stepped back. Because maybe the verdict wasn't punishment. It was prophecy. The Federation will fracture. Starfleet will militarize. Empires will fall, rise, and fall again. And through it all, one pattern remains: hope, betrayal, survival, and then silence. We keep thinking Q was here to test them, that he held their fate in his hands. But what if that's the twist? What if Q's final judgment was this: that they already chose their own ending, and he just let it play out?